She had been sitting on the same wooden bench for 3 days. The old train station was cold at night and burning hot by day, yet she didn't move. Her dress was dusty, her hands folded around a small bag that looked too light to hold a life. People came and went, curious glances falling on her as whispers passed. Who is she waiting for? The ticket master asked once, but she only shook her head. Children pointed, merchants ignored her, and still she stayed. 3 sunsets had passed, 3 nights of silence, and still her eyes searched the tracks as if someone important had promised to arrive. But no train brought him. No voice called her name. Only the endless waiting and the question no one dared to ask. Her face carried the weight of sleepless nights. Dark circles framed her tired eyes, and her lips were pale, cracked from thirst. Each time a train whistled in the distance, a flicker of hope lit her gaze, only to die the moment strangers stepped off instead. Hunger gnawed at her, but she clutched her small bag tighter, too proud to beg for bread. Her shoulders drooped, her back curved, as if the world itself pressed down on her. The once neat dress she wore now looked wrinkled and heavy with dust, telling the story of hours spent in silence. She was not just waiting, she was fading. And yet, some invisible thread held her there, binding her to that empty platform with a hope she could not kill. People began to notice her. Vendors carrying baskets slowed their steps. Travelers exchanged quiet looks as they passed. Whispers floated through the air like drifting smoke. Who is she waiting for? Some said she must be abandoned. Others guessed she was running from something. A few pitied her, but no one came close. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, asking questions only to be hushed. To them, she was a mystery, too silent, too stubborn to leave. Day by day, the station turned her into a story people told each other in hushed voices. Yet no one dared to sit beside her. No one dared to ask why her eyes never left the tracks. 3 days had passed, yet she remained on the same wooden bench. She didn't stretch her legs, didn't wander for water, didn't even search for food. Her body seemed frozen in a posture of waiting, as if the station itself had claimed her. People came and went, their journeys beginning and ending, but she stayed. Some thought she had no place to go. Others believed she was clinging to a promise no one else could see. Every train that thundered past raised hope, then crushed it. And still, her eyes searched the tracks with quiet desperation. She hadn't moved an inch, and the question everyone carried but no one dared to ask was the same. Why hasn't she moved? She hadn't always been this silent figure on a station bench. Once, she had a home filled with laughter, but it was taken from her in a single night of fire and smoke. With nothing left, she answered a letter, an offer of marriage from a distant rancher she had never seen. His words had promised safety, a roof, and perhaps even love. She carried that letter like a fragile thread of hope, folded and refolded until the paper grew thin. It was the reason she had traveled miles to this forgotten station. It was the reason she waited still, her heart tied not to the bench, but to the promise of a man who never came. The fire had stolen everything. One moment, the house was warm with lantern light. The next, it was swallowed in flames. She remembered the choking smoke, the screams, the unbearable heat. By the time neighbors came running, it was too late. Her parents were gone. Her younger sister, too. In the ashes, only she remained, alive but hollow. The world that once felt safe now seemed cruel and empty. Since that night, every spark of laughter, every scent of bread baking, every hum of lullabies had vanished from her life. The fire did not just burn her home, it burned her future. When everything was lost, a single letter felt like a lifeline. It came from a distant land, written by a rancher she had never met. The words were simple but filled with hope. A roof to sleep under, food to eat, and perhaps the chance to be loved again. To many it sounded like a business arrangement, a mail-order bride sent to heal a lonely man's house, but to her, it was more. It was a promise of escape from the ashes of her past. She carried that promise across miles of empty land, clutching it as if it were the last piece of her future. And with every heartbeat, she believed that when she reached him, her life would begin again. The train she arrived on hissed into silence. Passengers hurried off, families embraced, and wagons rolled away. She clutched her bag tighter, scanning every face, waiting for someone to call her name. Minutes stretched into hours. By nightfall, the station was nearly empty, but still she sat, whispering to herself that maybe he was delayed. The next morning came, then another, and still no one appeared. No letter, no message, no man on horseback. Each sunrise carried new hope. Each sunset crushed it. She was a bride without a groom, a traveler with no welcome, and in the eyes of strangers, she was just a woman left behind. The wooden bench became her bed, her prison, and her only companion. Each night, the cold crept into her bones, forcing her to wrap her thin shawl tighter. Hunger twisted her stomach, yet she refused to beg from passing travelers. She sipped water from a cracked jug the station boy filled once out of pity, but never asked for more. Dust gathered in her hair, and her once clean dress now carried the smell of smoke, sweat, and waiting. Trains roared in and out, carrying new stories, new faces, new beginnings, but never hers. With every whistle, she sat straighter, eyes searching desperately, only to slump again when the platform emptied. The longer she stayed, the smaller she felt, as if the world itself had forgotten she existed. She had nothing left to trade with the world. No coins hidden in her pocket, no bread wrapped in cloth, no friend waiting to offer a kind word. All she carried was a worn-out bag with a single dress and the fragile letter that had promised her a new life. Her stomach ached from emptiness, her lips cracked with thirst, but still she refused to move. It wasn't food that kept her alive. It was hope. Hope that maybe the next train would bring the man who had written to her. Hope that the promise wasn't a cruel trick. And so, even with nothing in her hands, she clung to the only thing she had left in her heart. On her lap rested a small faded bag, light enough that a child could carry it. Inside lay a single dress, neatly folded though travel dust had already settled on its edges. But more precious than the cloth was the old letter she kept tucked inside. Its paper was worn thin from being opened and read too many times, the ink fading in places where her fingers had traced the words again and again. Whenever doubt rose in her chest, she pressed that letter to her heart, as if it could whisper strength into her. The bag held no food, no money, no treasures, only the promise of a future she was still waiting to touch. When darkness fell and the station grew quiet, she let her strength slip away. By day, she kept her chin high, pretending she was only waiting. But each night, when the lanterns dimmed and footsteps faded, she bowed her head and wept. The tears came soundless, soaking into the thin fabric of her shawl. She didn't want strangers to hear, didn't want pity from those who passed. Her sobs belonged only to the empty tracks, to the promise that never arrived. Under the cold stars, she cried not just for the man who hadn't come, but for all she had lost, and for the fear that no one in this wide world would ever claim her again. On the third morning, as the first light spilled across the empty tracks, she lifted her tired eyes and saw him. A small boy, no more than 8, stood a few steps away. His boots were scuffed and dusty, too big for his feet, the laces dragging across the ground. His hat sat crooked on his head, and his face was streaked with the dirt of long days spent outdoors. Unlike the others who passed her by, he did not rush or whisper. He simply stared with a strange, searching gaze, as if he already knew her story without a word being spoken. And then, with a quiet courage far beyond his years, he took a step closer. The boy's voice was softer than the morning breeze, yet it cut through the silence around her. He tilted his head, his wide eyes filled with a mix of innocence and curiosity. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, almost in a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the fragile stillness she carried. For a moment her heart stumbled. No one had spoken to her in days. No one had dared to break the invisible wall she had built around her waiting. She opened her mouth, but no words came, only the sting of tears pressing behind her eyes. How could she explain that she was waiting not just for someone, but for the only chance she believed she had left? Before she could answer, the boy's gaze deepened, as if he carried a secret too heavy for his small shoulders. He shifted his dusty boots against the stone floor, gathered a breath, and spoke words that froze her heart. "Will you marry my father?" The station seemed to fall silent. Even the crows on the wires paused their cries. She blinked, certain she had misheard, but the boy's eyes did not waver. In his voice there was no play, no childish jest, only raw need, the kind that came from a life already touched by loss. Her pulse quickened, her lips parted, yet no reply came. Of all the questions she had expected in her waiting, this was the one she could never have imagined. Her breath caught in her throat, the boy's question echoing louder than the rumble of any train. Marry his father? The words felt unreal, like a dream spoken out loud. She stared at him, searching his small, dirt-streaked face for a hint of mischief, but found only sincerity. The way he clutched his hat against his chest, the way his boots stood firm, it was clear he meant every word. A shiver ran down her spine. Who was this man the boy called father? Why had he sent his child instead of coming himself? And what kind of story was she about to walk into? The station seemed to lean closer, waiting for an answer that never came. All she could think was one question. Who is his father? The boy lowered his voice, as though telling her something the world wasn't meant to hear. "My father. He's a rancher," he said, eyes fixed on the ground. "He lives far from town, out where the land is wide and quiet." His words carried no pride, only the heavy weight of solitude. "Since Mama passed, it's just been him and me. He works hard, but the house feels too big, too empty." The boy's small fingers tightened around the brim of his hat. "He doesn't laugh much anymore. He doesn't talk much either. But he's kind. He's lonely." The words lingered in the air, painting the picture of a man she could almost see. Strong hands, tired eyes, and a silence as deep as her own. The boy's eyes dropped as he spoke again, his voice carrying the ache of memories too heavy for someone so young. "Papa lost Mama years ago," he whispered. "One winter night, when the snow was high and the doctor too far. She never woke again." He swallowed hard, kicking the ground with his boot as though trying to bury the pain beneath the dust. Since then, Papa has carried the ranch alone. He works from sunrise until the stars are out, but when he comes inside, the house feels empty. He keeps her photograph on the mantel, but he never talks about her. Sometimes when he thinks I'm asleep, I hear him crying. The boy's small shoulders trembled as he said it, painting a picture of a man broken not by work, but by loss. The boy lifted his eyes again, and this time there was no hesitation. "Papa is strong," he said softly, "but he can't do everything." His voice wavered, carrying both truth and longing. "He tries to cook, but sometimes we just eat bread and milk. He tries to sew my clothes, but the stitches never stay. He says I'm growing fast, but I know he worries when I get sick." The boy's small hands tightened around his hat as he whispered the words that felt older than his years. "He needs someone, not just for him, but for me. Someone who will care for me the way a mother would. Someone who won't leave." His eyes shimmered as if begging her to understand. He wasn't just asking for his father. He was asking for himself. Her heart twisted at the boy's words. Part of her longed to believe this was the answer to her waiting, that maybe fate had led her to this child and his lonely father. Hope tugged at her, whispering of a home, of belonging, of being wanted again. But fear was just as loud. What if the man was cruel? What if the boy's request was nothing more than desperation? She had already lost everything once. Could she survive another betrayal? Her hands tightened around her small bag, the old letter pressing against her fingers like a reminder of promises broken. In her chest, two forces pulled against each other, fear telling her to run, hope begging her to stay. And she sat frozen between them, unsure which voice would win. After a long silence, she finally drew a shaky breath. The boy's eyes were still fixed on her, wide with hope too heavy for his small frame. She wanted to say no, to protect herself from another wound, but the words never came. Instead, she found herself whispering, "I will see." It wasn't a promise of marriage, not yet, but a step. She rose from the wooden bench that had held her for 3 endless days, her bag clutched tightly in her hand. The boy's face lit up, his boots tapping excitedly against the stone floor as he nodded. She told herself it was only to look, only to decide with her own eyes. Yet deep down she already knew this choice would change everything. When the wagon rolled to a stop, she saw the ranch stretched wide against the horizon. The fences leaned crooked, the barn carried scars of years of storms, and the house itself stood weathered, its paint peeled and its porch sagging. Yet, in the middle of that brokenness, there was life. Chickens scattered across the yard, their feathers glinting in the sun. A thin dog wagged its tail at the sight of the boy. Rows of corn bent in the wind, stubbornly clinging to the soil. The land was tired, but it was breathing. And for the first time in years, she felt the strange tug of a place that was both fragile and alive, like her own heart. As her eyes wandered, she saw life stretched in every direction, goats balanced on rocky patches, bleating softly as if to greet her. Chickens scratched the dirt, scattering feathers and dust, while a pair of horses lifted their heads from the field, their manes glowing in the sun. Beyond the yard, neat rows of corn and beans reached toward the sky, fragile yet determined, proof of hard hands that refused to give up. And farther still, the land opened wide, rolling hills, wild grass, and a horizon that seemed endless, touching the heavens themselves. It was rough, imperfect, and worn thin by time, yet it pulsed with a stubborn kind of beauty. Here, she thought, was a place where broken things might still learn how to grow again. Standing at the edge of the ranch, she felt her chest rise with a strange mix of calm and unease. The wide land and the sounds of animals brought her a comfort she hadn't known in years, like a forgotten memory of safety trying to return. Yet with every comforting breath came a shadow of fear, the fear of the unknown. Who was the man she was about to meet? Would he be kind, or would his silence hide cruelty? The place seemed alive, but it also carried the weight of secrets buried in its soil. Her hands tightened around her bag as if holding on to the last piece of certainty she had. Comfort whispered that maybe this could be home. Fear warned that stepping inside could change her life forever. At last, he appeared on the porch, wiping dust from his hands with an old cloth. He was taller than she expected, his shoulders broad from years of work, yet his movements carried the heaviness of a man long accustomed to silence. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a story no words could tell, kindness buried under layers of weariness, gentleness wrapped in sorrow. They did not sparkle with charm, but they carried honesty, raw and unpolished. He stood still, almost unsure, as if measuring whether hope was safe to show. She felt her heart stumble. This was not the man from the letter, full of promises. This was a man carved by loss, hardened by labor, softened only by the boy at his side. And she could not yet decide if that made him dangerous or safe. The man's brow furrowed the moment his eyes shifted from her to the boy at his side. For a heartbeat, he didn't speak, just stood frozen, the cloth hanging loose in his hand. Then, with a quiet sigh, he crouched to his son's level. "You brought her here?" His voice was steady, but beneath it lingered surprise and a trace of worry. The boy nodded eagerly, clutching her sleeve as though afraid she might vanish. The rancher's gaze returned to her, heavy with unspoken questions. He hadn't expected a stranger to step into his world like this, not carried by a letter or arrangement, but by the bold hope of a child. The silence stretched long between them, filled with both gratitude and unease, as if fate had chosen for him something he was not yet ready to claim. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The boy shifted from one boot to the other, looking between his father and the woman with anxious hope. The rancher's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, only a slow exhale that carried years of loneliness. She lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag, unsure whether to smile or retreat. The air between them grew heavy, thick with things left unsaid, grief he carried but never voiced, fear she hid behind her waiting, and a child's desperate wish binding them together. It was not anger that filled the silence, but something far more fragile, two broken souls measuring whether they could trust the space that had suddenly opened between them. As the silence stretched, she felt the weight of his gaze press against her. His eyes carried no threat, yet there was a wall around him, built of sorrow and secrets she could not yet see through. The boy tugged gently at her hand, as if urging her to step closer, but her feet stayed rooted to the ground. This man was no stranger to pain. That much was clear. But pain could make people cruel just as easily as it could make them kind. She searched his face for an answer, for something to ease the storm inside her chest. But all she found was weariness, a quiet strength, and a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. And in that moment, only one question echoed in her mind. Can she trust him? That night, the house was quiet except for the creak of old wood and the restless cries of crickets outside. She lay awake on the small cot they had given her, staring at the ceiling, when a sound broke the silence, a rough, deep cough from the other room. At first, she thought it was only a passing fit, the kind any man might have after a long day's work. But it didn't stop. The coughing grew harsher, echoing through the thin walls, each breath dragged as though it fought against his chest. She sat up, heart pounding, torn between rushing to help and staying hidden. The boy slept soundly, curled in a blanket on the floor, unaware of the struggle only a few steps away. In that moment, she realized the man carried not only grief, but a sickness that he tried to keep buried in the dark. The next day confirmed her fears. She found him in the yard, a pail of water half lifted in his hand, when suddenly his body gave way. He didn't stumble like a tired man. He dropped, heavy and lifeless, as though sleep had struck him like a hammer. The pail crashed to the ground, spilling water into the dirt, while his son screamed and ran to his side. She rushed forward, heart racing, only to find him breathing deeply, trapped in a sleep so deep it looked like death. Minutes passed before he stirred again, confused but pretending nothing had happened. That was when she understood. This wasn't exhaustion, it was a disease. A curse that stole his strength without warning, pulling him into sudden, merciless slumber. And with that truth, a new fear clawed at her chest. How could a man so fragile protect his son? Or her? She soon realized why he never spoke of it. Each time the sickness struck, he forced himself back to his feet as if nothing had happened, brushing the dirt from his clothes, avoiding her eyes. He laughed it off in front of the boy, calling it just tiredness, though his trembling hands told a different story. At night, she heard him pacing the floor, fighting against the sleep that stalked him, as if sheer will could keep it away. He hid the truth not only from others but from himself, carrying his shame like an invisible chain. To admit his weakness would mean admitting he could not protect his son, his home, or even his pride. And so he buried it in silence, hoping no one would see how fragile he really was. The more she saw, the heavier her chest became. Fear crept into her heart like a shadow she could not shake. What if the sickness struck when he was riding? What if it came while he was working with fire or when the boy was far from help? Every sudden cough, every pause in his step made her flinch, waiting for him to collapse again. She wanted to trust his strength, but all she saw now was fragility. And though a part of her longed to care for him, another part whispered of danger, that this house might not be a refuge at all, but a place where she would lose herself again. Fear wrapped around her hope like a tightening rope, and for the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake by staying. The thought pressed heavy on her mind. If she chose to marry him, her life would not be easy. She would trade comfort for endless work, cooking, cleaning, tending to animals, and watching over a man whose body could betray him at any moment. She pictured long winters with no help but her own hands, nights of worry when he failed to wake, mornings of fear when his son asked questions she couldn't answer. There would be no promises of laughter-filled evenings, no certainty of a strong arm to lean on. Instead, it would be a life of sacrifice, of constant vigilance, of carrying a burden that was never meant to be hers. A life where love, if it came, would grow not in ease, but in struggle. But if she walked away, what waited for her beyond the ranch? Nothing but the same emptiness she had carried to that station. No home, no family, no future. Only the echo of footsteps with nowhere to go. The townsfolk would forget her face the moment she left, just as easily as the station master had when she sat alone for days. She would be a shadow drifting from place to place, carrying a worn bag and a broken promise. There would be no one to call her name, no one to ask if she was hungry, no child to tug at her hand. Leaving would mean freedom, yes, but the kind of freedom that felt like falling, with nothing to catch her. Her thoughts shattered when she felt a small tug at her side. She looked down and saw the boy's tiny fingers wrapped tightly around her hand, holding on as if she were his last anchor. His palm was warm, trembling slightly, and his eyes, wide, pleading, too old for his young face, searched hers with silent desperation. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The weight of his grip said everything. Don't leave me. In that moment, she wasn't just a stranger. She was the thin line between his loneliness and the chance of having a family again. Her heart ached as she realized that the choice before her was no longer only about herself. It was about the boy who clung to her as though letting go meant losing everything. Her chest tightened as the question rose inside her like a storm. Was this love or just need? The boy needed a mother, the father needed a companion, and she needed a place where she could finally belong. But was belonging the same as love? Was affection born out of choice or out of desperation? She feared that if she stayed, it would not be because her heart had freely chosen, but because none of them had anywhere else to go. Yet, when she felt the boy's hand gripping hers, she wondered if perhaps love was not always a matter of choice. It was sometimes the quiet answer to someone else's silent plea. And in that silence, she felt both trapped and strangely seen. One afternoon, as she carried water from the well, a neighbor woman passed by, her eyes sharp with scorn. She stopped, folded her arms, and let out a cold laugh. "So this is what you've become," she sneered. "A stranger who wandered into a lonely man's house for food and a roof. Nothing more." The words stung like fire, cutting deeper than she expected. Her cheeks burned, and though she tried to keep her head high, shame seeped into her bones. She wanted to shout back, to tell the woman about the letter, the waiting, the boy's desperate plea, but her throat locked tight. The cruel whisper clung to her, echoing louder than her own thoughts, making her wonder if the world would ever see her as anything more than a beggar of scraps and pity. The woman's cruel words did not stay at the well. By evening, whispers had already begun to float through the valley like smoke carried on the wind. At the market, women covered their mouths and muttered when she passed. Men shook their heads, calling her a burden disguised as a bride. Some said she had trapped the rancher, others that she had come to steal what little he had. None spoke to her directly, yet the sting of their rumors wrapped around her like barbed wire. Every glance felt like judgment, every silence like condemnation. She had thought her loneliness ended when she stepped off that station bench, but now it seemed she had only traded one kind of waiting for another, waiting for a place where she might truly be seen without suspicion. Each word, each whisper clung to her skin like dust she couldn't wash away. She had survived fire, hunger, and nights of loneliness, but nothing cut as deeply as the quiet laughter of those who judged her. Their eyes stripped her of dignity, painting her as desperate, shameless, unworthy of respect. She avoided looking up when she walked through town, afraid of the smirk she might see. Even inside the ranch, their voices followed her, echoing in her mind until she began to believe them. Humiliation weighed heavier than hunger ever had. It hollowed her spirit, made her question whether she had been foolish to stay. And for the first time since the boy had taken her hand, she wondered if she truly belonged anywhere at all. That night, long after the lamps had gone dark, she sat on the edge of her small bed with the bag in her lap. Her hands trembled as she folded the same dress she had carried from the station, slipping the old letter back into its pocket. Each fold felt like a goodbye, each breath like surrender. She told herself it would be easier to leave quietly before dawn, before the boy could stop her with those pleading eyes. The thought of facing the town's whispers again filled her with dread, but staying felt heavier, like living under a weight that would slowly crush her. For the first time, she rose to her feet, bag clutched tight, the door only a few steps away. She almost left. Almost. Just as she tightened her grip on the bag, a sharp noise cut through the stillness of night, the startled cry of a horse, the clatter of a feed bucket. She froze, her heart thudding, then rushed to the window. There, in the pale light of the moon, she saw him. The rancher lay sprawled in the dirt beside the trough, his hands still smeared with grain, his body frighteningly still. The animals circled nervously, as if sensing something was wrong. For a moment, the world around her blurred. The whispers, the shame, her decision to leave, all vanished, replaced by the stark sight of a man fighting against the weight of his own body. Her bag slipped from her hand as instinct carried her toward him, fear and duty colliding in her chest. Her feet carried her before her mind could think. She dropped to the ground beside him, shaking his shoulders, calling his name. His face was pale, his breaths shallow, yet steady enough to tell her he was not lost. With trembling hands, she dragged him inside, laid him on the worn couch, and covered him with a blanket. The boy stirred from sleep, but she hushed him, whispering that Papa would be fine. Hour after hour she sat at his side, dabbing his forehead with cool water, forcing her eyes to stay open while exhaustion clawed at her. The lamp burned low, the night stretched endless, but she never moved. By dawn, when his eyes fluttered open at last, she was still there, tired, hungry, and broken herself, yet unwilling to leave his side. And in that long, sleepless night, something inside her began to change. As the morning light spilled across the room, she studied his face, lined, weary, marked by battles no one else could see. Before, she had only seen his weakness, the sudden falls, the silence he wrapped around his illness like a cloak of shame. But after watching him through the long night, a new truth revealed itself. Every time the disease dragged him down, he forced himself back again. Every collapse was not defeat, but proof of his will to keep living, to keep fighting for his boy, for the ranch, for whatever pieces of life he still held. His weakness was not weakness at all. It was endurance, stubborn and unyielding. And for the first time, she felt not fear, but respect. Maybe even something more. Later that day, when his strength had returned enough to sit by the fire, he turned his face toward her. His hands, rough and calloused, twisted nervously in his lap. For a long while he said nothing, as though the words themselves were too heavy to carry. Then at last, his voice broke the silence, low, raw, and edged with sorrow. "You deserve someone stronger than me," he whispered. His eyes did not quite meet hers, choosing instead to rest on the floorboards, as though ashamed to let her see the cracks in him. "A man who can stand without falling. A man who can give you more than half-finished days and empty nights." The confession was not pride, but surrender. The kind of truth that bleeds from a man who has carried his shame too long. Before the rancher could finish his broken words, a small voice cut through the heavy silence. The boy had been standing quietly in the doorway, clutching his worn blanket, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He stepped closer, his little boots tapping against the wooden floor, and with all the courage his small heart could muster, he whispered, "Please, stay. We're already a family." The room seemed to still, the fire crackling louder in the pause that followed. His words held no logic, no promise of comfort, only truth, spoken in the pure way only a child could. In that moment, she felt her throat tighten, her vision blur. All her doubts, all her fears, seemed to collide with the simple plea of a boy who only wanted a mother to stay. Her breath caught, and for a moment the world narrowed to the boy's trembling voice. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks before she could stop them. The rancher sat frozen, his lips parted, his own eyes glimmering with a pain he had long tried to hide. No one spoke. The silence was thick, heavy, yet it carried more weight than words ever could. In that fragile stillness, every wall she had built around her heart began to crumble. She wasn't looking at a broken man and a desperate child anymore. She was looking at a family that had already chosen her. And with that realization, the ache in her chest shifted into something new, something she had almost forgotten: belonging. By morning, her heart had made its choice, not out of pity for the boy's tears, nor out of obligation to the rancher's struggle, but out of something deeper, her own will. She had lived too long in the shadows of loss, too long defined by what had been taken from her. Here, in this quiet house filled with broken edges, she saw not ruin, but the raw beginning of a life she could shape. When she looked at the rancher, she no longer saw only weakness, she saw endurance. When she looked at the boy, she no longer saw desperation, she saw hope. And when she looked at herself, she no longer saw a woman abandoned at a station, but a woman choosing, for the first time, where she belonged. She would marry him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began to change, almost as if it had been waiting for her touch. She mended the torn curtains, patched the roof where rain had crept in, and filled the bare shelves with jars of food she carefully prepared. Flowers bloomed by the porch where weeds once grew, their colors softening the tired wood of the house. The boy laughed more often, chasing chickens through the yard, his laughter echoing across the fields like music. Even the rancher seemed different, his steps lighter, his silence no longer heavy but peaceful. The land was still rough, the work still endless, but now it carried warmth. Every corner of the ranch bore traces of her hands, her care, her love. What had once been a place of loneliness was becoming a home. The sickness never truly left him. There were still nights when he collapsed at the table, or days when sudden sleep stole him from his work in the fields. But he no longer carried the burden alone. She learned to read the signs, the slow heaviness in his steps, the distant glaze in his eyes, and she would gently guide him to rest before the disease could strike him down. The boy, too, became watchful, always ready with water or a blanket. What once had been a secret shame became something they faced together, not with fear but with quiet strength. His condition did not vanish, yet in their unity it lost its power to define them. Illness was no longer a curse, it was a battle, and now he had a family who refused to let him fight it alone. One quiet evening, the three of them sat together on the porch. The boy leaned against her side, half asleep, while the rancher's tired eyes softened as he watched the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. She looked out at the land, the fences still crooked, the barn still scarred, yet everything alive with warmth and laughter now. Her heart swelled, heavy not with sorrow but with gratitude. She remembered the station bench, the hunger, the whispers, the endless waiting. How close she had come to giving up. A smile touched her lips as she turned to the man beside her, her hand brushing against his. "I waited 3 days," she whispered, her voice trembling with both memory and joy. "But I found a lifetime." And in that moment, the broken woman who once sat alone at a station was gone. In her place stood a wife, a mother, and a heart finally home. Music.